of looking ahead, thinking about the year ahead for a few minutes. Then we'll move on to hear from Giselle about her research on review and revision processes of academic standards in other states around the country. And then we'll end with some updates and next steps, and hopefully conclude right at 6 o'clock. Any other items for the agenda? Great. Then let's go ahead for 2022. So a couple of just questions that I think are open for 2022. Ebony Rose and I have been reaching out to members to learn a little bit more about their experience of being on committees, whether they want to stay on the same committees this year as they were on last year, if they'd like to chair a committee that they had maybe served on previously. So we're trying to still work all that out, and we'll be talking about it at the working session and at the retreat, with a plan to vote on any new committee assignments, appointments at the February meeting. So at the moment, the chairpersonship of the Education Standards Committee is still TBD, but there's a couple of questions that that new chair will face. And so I thought it might be helpful to talk through some of those questions tonight, just to get the info out on the table. One of those things is the schedule of meetings, whether the time frame we had been using, the third Wednesday of the month, makes sense, or if people would like to reschedule that. The second is key areas of work. We have largely focused on social studies, literacy. We've talked a little bit about homeschooling. We've talked a little bit about digital and virtual learning. And then, of course, we've talked about this process of codifying the standards. But there's certainly plenty of other work that could fall into the Education Standards Committee bucket. We could be thinking more about students with disabilities and special education. We could be thinking about other standards that the board may want to update. There may also be other areas of work that may not find an easy home in some of the other board committees, but might find its home here rather. So just want to offer a few minutes to talk about, one, does this schedule of time still work well for the folks in this room right now? And I say this schedule, but I mean the third Wednesday of the month from 4:30 to 6. And then we'll talk about any other topics for this committee. So Ruth and Alistair, it looks like a thumbs up that third Wednesday still works for both of you. Okay. Zachary is joining us because he's thinking he might like to be part of this committee this year and is just sort of listening in to find out. So what does that look like for you, Zachary? You may have lost Zachary. Okay, well, for now, I'll note that we've got a yes from Alistair, a yes from Ruth. I'll check with Carlene when she's able to join. I feel bad that she's got a Monday morning meeting that is already a Monday afternoon meeting that is ongoing. And that way, when we start thinking about chairpersonship for this committee, we can make sure that that person has this information. What about other areas of work? Are there other things that we have not talked about in this committee that make sense to elevate? I mean, Alistair, you and I have talked a little bit about the literacy work, maybe taking up more time or space in this committee, but I'd just love to hear people's thoughts on what else might find its home here, or how you might like to see this committee spend its time.
You know, I think the social studies is very important, and we don't have standards yet, so we don't know how that's going to go and what work it's going to require of us. And I think trying to do something on the reading, which is something we all agree on, is super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree 100% on the social studies needing to still be a topic on this committee. Absolutely. Alistair?
Yeah, I agree with Representative Wattenberg. I think doing these two things well and doing these two things right would be a huge success. So happy to add things in. Hope it certainly as things change and new things come up and new ideas come up as we talk to our constituents. But this is already, I think, if we are to do these two things right and do them well, it's going to take plenty of our time.
Yep. Representative Parker, are you still here with us? Do you have other thoughts on this? Okay.
Hi, Zach.
I think he's here. He was here. Not sure. Might be on another call. Okay, so that's helpful to hear from folks. When Representative Reed is able to join us, we'll see if she's got other thoughts. If Representative Parker is able to join us back on audio, we'll get his thoughts as well. But for now, I think I'm going to turn this over to Giselle to share her research with us, and we'll just start that a couple moments early. Sound good? All right. Thank you so much for being here, Giselle. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So hello, everyone. I'm Giselle Miranda, and I am the Policy Fellow with the DC State Board of Education. I'm super excited and grateful to have a chance to share some of my research from the Education Standards Memo, and I hope it's helpful for you all moving forward. I'm going to go ahead and provide a quick brief overview of just the 3 points I want to touch on during my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and start out by talking about how I went about selecting the states in the memo, and also outlining states that have a bit of a more detailed process, and just going into that a little bit. Secondly, I'll go ahead and touch on how often standards are updated, at least for the states that are in the memo. And then lastly, I'll go ahead and distinguish which states have their standards review codified in statute versus in state board policy, which I think will be really helpful. So yeah, that's a quick overview. Then I'll leave time at the end for questions if you all have any. So jumping into the first point of how I selected particular states, this is outlined a little bit in the executive summary, but the states that I selected for this memo had accessible public records and information that I could find online. That said, some states like Colorado and Tennessee went into a lot more detail about explicitly explaining their process. So Colorado, for example, has a very detailed website that clearly lays out a timeline of their review and revision process, along with where they are in the process. So for them in particular, the review and revision periods include the creation of a standards committee. Then they also discuss drafting research and benchmark reports. And then they also consider public input and have multiple drafts of the standards before the state board ultimately approves them. In Tennessee, similar to Colorado, before the State Board of Education can actually set and approve academic standards, they first have to receive recommendations from an appointed committee. And that committee has already reviewed the work and the input of 2 separate committees who largely did a lot of work sifting through thousands of comments and just input from the public. So yeah, that's kind of details of Colorado and Tennessee specifically. And if you'd like, during the question and answer part of the presentation, I can go ahead and show you Colorado's website, which I think is really helpful. But moving on to how often standards are updated for states in the memo. So some states have revision periods, other states have a multi-phase schedule, and then there are other states that update 1 standard per year. So for the states that have revision periods, it's most of the states in the memo. So Colorado, for example, has this new process where they review and revise 1/3 of standards, and that's beginning in 2022. And then they'll update and review an additional 1/3 of their standards every 2 years. Tennessee, they review all sets of academic standards at a minimum of every 6 years. Virginia, they review subject areas at least once every 7 years. North Carolina, they review their content area every 5 to 7 years. California, they allow instructional material to be submitted for adoption at least once, but not more than twice every 8 years. Texas reviews their subject once every 8 years. Oklahoma revises subject matter materials. Yes.
What's the most frequent that you've seen?
That is a great question. I think the most frequent, from what I saw, Colorado has an interesting new process that they're doing starting in 2022, where it's every 2 years, it's a third of their subject standards. And in the memo, there is a table that kind of outlines how that looks like, specifically like which standards and when those will be updated. And then Maine has something that's really interesting too, which they have a multi-phase schedule where they try to phase in their standards in 4 years. So year 1 is reviewing and revising the standards. The second year focuses on the legislative process and approval. The third year supports with implementation, and then subsequent years after that is actually getting the schools to implement the standards, the new standards. And then Nebraska is also interesting. They do something different where they review 1 standard per year, and they must complete a review and revision period every 7 years. So hopefully that was helpful, Alistair. Okay. And then finally, which of these states have policies that are codified in statute versus state board policy? So all of the states that are listed in the memo, with the exception of North Carolina, are codified in statute. North Carolina has state board policies of how they go about reviewing content areas. But yeah, that is a very high-level overview of the memo. So I can go ahead and open it up to questions or share my screen too if you'd like to see any of the states that I mentioned and what their websites might look like.
Thank you. This is really helpful. May I jump in?
Yeah.
So the Nebraska example was interesting. And it's different from what you shared in the PDF. In the PDF, it says every 7 years. What is a different subject every year, you said?
Nebraska. Yes. So what I have is Nebraska reviews 1 standard per year and must complete the review and revision process every 7 years.
Okay. That's interesting. And I guess it's interesting to see. I mean, the 3 that stand out to me, right, are like, as examples, are revise a portion every X number of years, revise all of them every X number of years, or review like a different one every year. Are we missing any other? I mean, are those examples that you highlighted because you think they are the ones that are working well, or are those the option pools that are out there right now? What are the other options that are available?
So those are the ones, and I think I might have glazed over this a little bit. So for the states that I included in the memo, I included them because that's what is readily available, has either through their websites. I could just easily find information. There were other states that were a little bit more challenging to find what their process exactly was. And so, yeah, so it was a matter of accessibility, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Zachary, you want to go next?
I'll jump in and try and lower my hand. This is really helpful. So thank you for this overview. I wanted to just learn a little bit more when we talk about review the standards, like what that entails for some of these different states, in particular, like a state like Virginia, where they have like what it seems like this sequential annual rollout where they are going through these various steps. Is there a framework or a rubric of sorts that they're using to judge against the standards?
Yeah, that is a great question. I might have to follow up with you if that's okay, just to
Oh,
see
sure.
what's out there. But just so I can get this in my notes, just could you repeat what exactly you'd like to see?
Yeah, just generally when we talk about reviewing the standards, how are they, is there a systematic way that they're approaching that, either through a rubric, a framework, a vision statement or of some sorts? Just what that looks like.
Okay, perfect. I'll get that out to you.
I would also just note, I really like that the CTE standards are updated on a 5-year cycle, which makes a lot of sense, just given that our economy and business opportunities are changing. So that would allow like just those standards to be most up to date with whatever the world is at that time. So just calling that out too.
Yeah, Giselle,
Oh, sorry.
go ahead, Alex.
I was going to say, Zachary, one thing kind of related to your question that Giselle may have glossed over was some of the states actually define review and revision a little bit differently, right? Like some actually explicitly say, yes, we're going to look at standards every X number of years, but this doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a full-blown rewrite and review. It's just like every X number of years, we're going to check in. We're going to make sure that these standards are still relevant, that they're still, accessible, et cetera. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every time we say review and revision, it's like, well, we're going to scrap those and we're going to start again. And I actually think it might be Colorado. I can't remember, Giselle, and so please correct me if I'm wrong, where it may explicitly state that this does not mean a full-blown review and revision.
Makes sense.
Can I just follow,
Go ahead, Representative Wattenberg.
just following up on that, do any of them, I mean, I guess you're saying some make this explicit distinction between how often between a modest review and a real review. And I guess, so one question I have is, do any of them talk explicitly about how frequently they would do a total rewrite as opposed to building on what you have? Or, I mean, do any of them explicit on that in any way? It's obviously a continuum,
Yeah, that's a great question. From the top of my head, a lot of them have this ongoing basis of like, this might not entail a whole review of all of the standards, but it's kind of like case by case basis. But if you would like, I could also, in addition to answering Zachary's question, I can also send you any information that I find that has explicitly stating that within this certain time frame, the whole standards gets reviewed versus just specific
If
subjects.
they say anything about that process of sort of building on what you have versus
Sure.
total, I'd be curious. Then
Yeah,
they may say nothing because they may just leave that up to the folks.
Mhm.
It also make total sense.
Sure, I'll go ahead and write that down.
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful because I know, Ruth, when we talked about the social studies standards, this was a question we had early on, which is, do we have to fully revise the social studies standards? Can we pick only aspects of it to revise? And because we have so little in our statute around reviewing standards, we had a little bit of a Pandora's box problem that once we open standards for review and revision, there's very little in the way of guardrails to keep things from being fully reviewed. So that I think is an interesting question, that if there's good examples from how other states frame it, as we think about whether we want to codify state board policy or seek some sort of statutory way to handle codifying the review of academic standards in DC, that may be something we want to write in so that we don't find ourselves facing a full rewrite each time we do it, but that we have the appropriate guardrails in place. The other question I have, Giselle, because I think this is super helpful, is I like that there's some states that are explicit about not just the review cycle, but also the implementation timeline. Obviously we're starting to sort of muddle our way through that with OSCE in terms of what will happen with the social studies standards and what is the expected rollout of standards versus required implementation. what sort of support will be available from the state for that. Are any of the states that you laid out that talk about that sort of cycle, is there any additional information on how they do that? I'm thinking, Zachary often is the one who calls us back to remind us about supports for schools. Like, is there more description on how states do this rollout work with their LEAs across the state?
That's another great question.
Okay.
I was focused on a lot of the actual, just the review.
Yeah.
So if I found implementation, I didn't really dive into that. So
Okay.
I feel like a lot of my answers, I'm sorry, I've been like, I'll follow up with you all, but these are great.
No, that's the right answer. If that's the answer, that's a great answer.
Look a little more deeply into in order to get accurate information for you all.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Giselle.
Sure.
Other questions, wonderings, things that stand out to folks from this memo?
I have one more, Giselle.
No worries.
As you were looking at this, what are some variables you think we ought to be considering to find the right fit?
Good question. I think something, at least for me, that I found really helpful as someone in the public that was trying to look at this process was the way Colorado has it outlined online is incredibly helpful. It just gives you a timeline of where the state board is at in reviewing the process, if it even has reached the state board yet, or if it's still within a committee. And like, what is a committee? I also saw a lot of that too, where some states create committees in the process, but they don't really explain what exactly they do. So I think the explicit nature of the process and having it on an online is helpful.
That's great. I think, that fits into this broader vision and momentum I think we've got on the board of stakeholder engagement and outreach and all that. And communicating information transparently, right? But was there a difference between, small state, big state, like other variables or factors you saw that shaped how states decided which way to go?
Not necessarily, because I looked at some of the bigger states like California and Texas, and in terms of like when they review, they're kind of on a consistent timeline there. Between that like 5 to 8 year period is when they go through and do these review and revisions. Same with some of these smaller states as well that are in the memo. So in terms of the timeline of reviewing these different things, they're kind of on that same timeline. North Carolina does have, are embedded in state board policy rather than statute. So I think it was kind of interesting.
One other question on my end, also just knowing that we talked about assessments at our last meeting, and with the revision of these standards are likely changes to assessments, and would just be interested in knowing like how these states tackle that as they are updating the standards. And so it seems pretty clear now that the actual updating of standards may not be happening as often as the cycle. Like oftentimes they're just reviewing. Just like, and maybe that in and of itself could serve as a filter of sorts to say, whatever changes we are proposing to the standards, would it help students meet the qualifications of our state assessment, for example? So would just be curious, like how those states are thinking about changes to the standards, but also any necessary changes to the state assessments that may be linked to them.
Absolutely, that's really interesting, that piece of the assessments.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think understanding as well if there's any information on the cycle in which they update the assessments, like is it partnered, right? With each time the standards are updated, the assessments are updated. I'm not sure how easy this would be to find, but I'm very curious about the cost implications of that, because assessments are notoriously expensive. And so I'm sort of thinking aloud here, but the idea that if they're not fully overhauling the standards, but rather just tweaking some things, that would seem to have lower cost implications for assessment changes, versus if they're fully overhauling standards, you probably need a much larger overhaul of assessments, and the cost of that. For all of this, it's also so interesting, just as an observation, that the states in the memo are by and large states. So I'm also curious how that affects the cost of things. Maine is probably the smallest in terms of population of the ones that are on there. But you have sort of larger sets of students affected by these standards, larger state Department of Ed budgets, than perhaps what we may find ourselves working with. Fascinating stuff. Any other questions, wondering? Zachary, go ahead.
No, I was just going to thank you again for putting this together, Giselle. It is really helpful.
Yeah, really helpful and concise. So thanks for making it really easy to follow through everything and lay it out and ask good questions. And thanks for any of the research that you're going to do on these follow-up questions, because I know we're going to be excited to see that as well.
Yeah, definitely. This is something that's really interesting to me. So thank you all for allowing me to be part of it, and also allowing me to learn more. Like, it's been really great. So I will go ahead and look through all these different questions, and from what I find, at least, I'll send my results to all of you in a big email.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Giselle. Thanks. I appreciate it. Oh, and good. Dr. Reed is here. I am glad, Dr. Reed, that your meeting finally released you.
It was shaky. Am I there? Oh, hold on. I can't see everybody. There we go. Hello. Welcome, Zach.
Hello.
Hi, Giselle.
So, Carlene, we just got Giselle's great overview of her memo and research, but I wanted to make sure before we moved on, if you had any questions on the memo that were top of mind for you, that we got those in before Giselle leaves us.
Not at the moment, but I can probably get them to you soon.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. All right, well, Giselle, thank you. We will then move on to some updates and next steps on the topics under discussion for this committee. So can I turn first to you, Representative Chang, talk to us about literacy?
Yes, thank you. And I just, if there is space and time for Alex to screen share the current state of our vision and recommendation statement from the literacy committee meetings. Would love feedback from Representative Parker, Representative Wattenberg, and Representative Reed. It's short, and happy to share it after, and would love your longer feedback as well. I've shared previous iterations with you, and this will be the last. So originally we intended 5 meetings to come up with this final product, and so far I've been getting positive feedback from the attendees about continuing it, around thinking about implementation and actually, continuing the relationship building, trust building, collaboration across the various acronyms and stakeholders who show up to our meetings. But I said this at our last meeting, I've been just delighted that we've gotten a really wide range of literacy stakeholders, including formal, non-formal, and informal education, learning opportunities that I find really important. So school librarians, DC Public Library feedback has also been a part of this, in addition to UDC and their literacy team's feedback on this. And so not just thinking about what happens in the classroom at schools, but also what happens beyond.
Awesome.
Alex, I have lots more to say, but would love whenever you're ready.
Alistair, quick
Yes.
question, and I am got it. So this is okay. I was gonna say I just wanted to confirm what document you wanted feedback on, but it's this one, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
And
Alistair, do you want me to drop the link in the chat as well for folks?
great, yep.
Okay.
And just so Zachary, you're in the loop as well. Almost everyone has already provided feedback on this. The last round will be a last draft, but what started as a very informal meeting with folks, literacy folks from USC and DCPS and Public Charter School Board and et cetera, has turned into a much more kind of structured conversation that we have once a month. And so these have been iterated and drafted, and all of your feedback was run by the committee on whether to incorporate or not. And Alex included, thank you for sharing your feedback in this as well. We were trying to find the right level of analysis where all of us across various areas of the work can agree on, but it's not so mushy that it's just, literacy is important, right?
Dr. Reed, do you have a question?
My apologies. I'm like navigating on my phone. So I circle back with Representative Chang about two pieces to include, and one of them was related to there's an emphasis on experts, which we definitely know there are experts in literacy, but just think about the climate of, we know we have teachers or professionals in buildings who may already have some level of expertise. So just how do we honor and amplify like people who already might be doing that work or know it? I just felt like when I read it, I just kept seeing experts over and over again. So is there any like statement we can draft that just honors the current level of expertise we may have, or even recruiting people who, I'm not even sure we ever like collected information on people who might be credentialed or already have certain whatever related to literacy that would be considered an expert already in our buildings. And then the other piece that I recommended was, I see Ed Reports is cited. I recommended adding What Works Clearinghouse, as it's an older established repository for evidence-based practice or interventions. I know for at least math at one point, Ed Reports had some like pushback from math professionals related to like their processes for how they're rating materials. So if we can just add like another entity that does something similar to give people options for how materials are rated. That was my feedback.
No, thank you, Dr. Reed. Can I touch on that first point with you and just get your feedback? So what folks, for example, from the Reading Clinic, DC Reading Clinic, which is a DCPS program, told me was that there are not enough coaches to lead the program, which is why they're growing at the pace that they're growing at. That until they get another cohort of teachers who have gotten through that training program, they don't have enough coaches to then train another batch. And the same has been true for the rollout of letters, is what I understand it to be. And so that's been something that American University is working on, UDC is working on, to try to, add this. And I think you're right that the word expert is really loaded here and needs to be unpacked. From what I've been hearing, right, we still have a dearth of folks who, not only can do it themselves, but in particular, the hard part is then training others to do it. And so personally, right, I love the idea of having our homegrown version. The DC Reading Clinic from Mary Clayman is homegrown, right? It's a DCPS program with DCPS of staff that are leading, versus what a lot of other states have done, which is hire an external contractor to come in to do. And I think it's really exciting that we have this internal homegrown version. So part of it is, sorting out what it is that we can do to make sure that gets fostered, right? And it's innovative, it's local, it's sustainable that way, right? But then also acknowledge, where our limitations are and try to sort out how we do that. So I'd love your feedback on that tension and that piece.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like even with retention, or to build on your point, Representative Chang, how or maybe this is captured there, but I'm just talking because you just mentioned, but the grow your own, like how do we even retain those individuals so that what often people say is like we build up some level of capacity in our city and the individuals go off and take that knowledge other places. So, even like pipelines for, just incentivizing or something to just retain that knowledge so that they don't get gobbled up by, the other, entities or districts that we have around us, or even just with like thinking about, again, the landscape of what's going on in our country where so many people are taking new careers or exploring new places because remote, work is an option. So even just thinking about like, how do we build in like almost a career ladder or something related to just retaining once we get people, once you build more capacity.
Yeah. And just want to highlight, I thought we had incorporated your edits, Dr. Reed, but we're looking at an old December version. The January version should have your feedback, if not as a footnote, then incorporated in. And sorry about that. But the January one has a few more recommendations, but in general, it's similar wording. And Representative Wattenberg.
Representative Wattenberg, you're on mute.
I like a lot of what's here very much. I have a question and one concern, and it also goes to who is this for? And what do we expect to do with this in terms of the vision? What I see not here that does concern me, and I should start by saying there's so much that is here that's good. I mean, what the teachers need and what different people need. And I think that's well done. I think there's a really critical missing group here, which is kind of reading specialists at the school level. I mean, when I think of our schools, okay, yeah, we're going to provide really good training to our classroom teachers who are in the K-2 space. So that's gonna, so part of it's a timeline issue, right? But part of it is, okay, let's say they're trained, right? Then, people are gonna leave in the next year. Who's gonna retrain them? Where's that gonna happen? But at the school level, in DCPS, starting next September, I believe, every K-2 student is supposed to get screened for dyslexia. And then presumably the point is they get an intervention at an appropriate level. So it could be, formally what's called, a tier 2 or a tier 3. If it's tier 2, then the classroom teacher is doing it. But how is that happening? How is the scheduling at that school happening? Or is there somebody else at the school who's going to provide that kind of small group intervention? And then what about tier 3 students who really do need somebody expert? So I say all this, I'm not trying to get too detailed, except I think if we don't have something at the school level that supports teachers, this is just going to be a big fail. And I think that's a huge thing that we need. So
absolutely. And I think that's part of what we want to do in the next phase of this. When we got into that level of detail at these meetings, it was too removed for the public librarians and UDC folks, right? It was too specifically targeting this
the school, what's going to support the teachers.
Exactly.
And the kids.
And so I think what we're hoping to do next, right? And this is where it ties into a conversation about that I want your feedback about, which is one level more macro, which is I've been really excited to get all these stakeholders into one room together once a month, and everything from OSCE and UDC meeting and having a conversation about how we can Dr. Reed, build out some kind of a teacher pipeline that's focused on this. UDC was the highest ranked literacy training program by NCTQ, right? And there's so much opportunity for us to be building out our local capacity. What does that look like, right? Is it a Singapore style if we pay for your master's in ed and or a bachelor's in education with a very strong focus on structured literacy? The agreement is, you teach it DCPS for 5 years, right? I mean, what are our options, right? And so that stuff I find super exciting. And so I think as we so far, right, and to answer your first question, Representative Wattenberg, the idea was, how do we get all these stakeholders behind a vision statement that we can all agree on? And the most detailed it can get, and then how do we actually support each of these actors to then figure out the details of that implementation? together. But I hear what you're saying, and the way that that's executed needs to be done equitably across the city. Otherwise, it's not going to be helpful.
Let me just follow up on one thing. If the point is
Yeah.
to get people to sign on to it, the stakeholders, I would think that if people thought about it, stakeholders who are teachers and principals at the school level are going to want to see something that talks about the support that's going to be provided at the school level. So I'm just going to say that you're in touch with them. I'm not. And the other thing is, I love that NCTQ gave these great grades to UDC, and maybe we should hear from the folks at NCTQ. So are you in touch with them?
I am in touch with them. Yep.
Yeah. So
I'm in touch with them, and have been the folks I've been talking to have been really helpful in also just sharing what else is happening in other states around these higher ed partnerships, so that we as a committee, and then we as a board, I hope, can look at, okay, here's what other states have done, right? Does one of those work for us in DC, or should we learn from their experiences and implement something else?
Thank you.
So,
And sorry, go ahead.
just one question for you, Representative Chang. So I want to dig in a little bit more on the levels you're talking about. So this is the DC-wide version for early literacy, not just focused on schools, but thinking about all of the players who are part of this work.
Exactly. So I've looked a lot at the country of Malta. You've heard me talk about them before. They are a tiny little country, saw skyrocket growth in literacy outcomes. A big part of their intervention was just bring all the stakeholders together. So we stopped doing things in silos and stopped just, this nonprofit works with these second graders and then doesn't know what happens to them in third grade, right?
Yep.
Is a really stark, extreme example, but how do we actually make sure that we're all first going towards a similar vision, and then taking that to implement it collaboratively?
So that's exactly where my head goes to next, which is, once this statement is final and it's agreed to, who comes together next to decide who takes which parts of the puzzle, and then how they reconvene to check on how it's going, how often, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I don't have an answer, and I think that's what we need to figure out. My first interpretation of that is commitments, right? We don't have any powers to say you have to do this from where we sit. So making very clear commitments together on certain aspects of this, I think, is a really good starting point. Certainly that won't force this to happen, right? But I also don't know if a forcing of anything without buy-in is going to work anyways. So I think at this point it's engaging buy-in, collaboration, commitments.
Yep. Have you talked at all with the, oh my gosh, now I'm going to forget the name of the group, and maybe John Paul or Darren or Alex will remember. There was a group that was based on the Model Strive Collaborative that was here in DC, that was a collective impact organization. It had been incubated in the DME, and then it grew out. It was supposed to be like a cradle to career and beyond effort. Raise DC. So it had a lot of energy at the beginning, and then I don't know if it even still exists. I certainly don't hear from it in the same way. I'm curious if you've talked with anyone from Raise DC. Okay, because I feel like there's probably lessons learned both in the what to do and pitfalls to avoid in the future.
100%. And so one of the things we heard was, that I heard was, be really discreet about what the committee comes together to do. Mm-hmm. Very specific. So I set this 5 blocks, we're going to get this done, and then we can work together to figure out, okay, if we have another 5 meetings, what is the final product we want? Because just having a meeting, people are going to drop off and it's not going to be super impactful, right?
Yeah.
I think what's been exciting is that people show up, there's very discrete task at hand, very discrete product to give feedback on and unpack together. And so if we were to continue with this committee work after the 5th meeting, I think I would want to continue it that way rather than, and I know that that's part of what Raise DC did, but in a very sort of discreet, we don't need this committee to exist for the sake of this committee.
Awesome. Ruth, is that a new hand?
Oh, no.
Okay. Any other questions for Alistair then? I'm just mindful we've got about 8 minutes left.
And I mean, my question here is also this, like, I get really excited, Dr. Reed, about how you got your master's and doctorate. I mean, amazing that we now as a city get to benefit from your education and training, right? It's how do we, that is a very exciting piece for me as we talk about literacy, because I think it builds the pipeline. UDC has the highest DCPS teacher retention rate of any higher ed program, right? And so what is it that we can do to really, I mean, what did someone say to me the other day? Instead of saying knock out 2 birds with 1 stone, feed 2 birds with 1 grain. How do we do that, right, in this work? And would this committee have the buy-in and interest to try to push something like that? Yeah.
I mean, I think this committee is a great place for it. That's my personal take, but it looks like there's some nodding heads. Ruth had suggested as much at the start as well.
Alistair, can you say something about, I guess, just to help us all sort of get into the same thinking place about where this could go? Just talk about who are the stakeholders around the table? I have some sense of it, but not complete. And also your sense of how the agencies that would have to, at least in the K-12 sector, I realize the independent sector is different, but in the K-12 sector, whether it's, charters, charter board, DCPS or OSSI, how are they, what kind of buy-in do they have? What's your sense of?
Yep.
So it's both things. Who are the stakeholders at the table, and especially who's very involved? Okay.
I can answer the first one and want everyone's feedback on the second of what needs to happen next. So we've got folks like the DC Library Association, UDC, DCPS, OSSI. We've got two reading instructors from DCPS, one reading instructor from KIP. We've got one head of school for a charter. We've got someone from DC Public Charter School Board. And then we've got a wide array of nonprofits, local foundations. The DME's office has also been coming to these, WTU, and Representative Wattenberg joined the last one, and I warmly welcome folks to join the next meeting as well, which is February 16th.
And how did the teachers get there? They sort of self-volunteered, or they got a name by somebody, or so were they?
Oh, I mean, this has been a very informal group.
Yeah, okay. That's
what I did was reached out to WTU and Empower Ed and asked who are some reading instructors who would be willing to give feedback on OSSI's literacy plan. Got over 100 responses back.
Wow.
Honestly, just been amazing. I've been slowly talking through with everyone one-on-one.
Wow.
And the ones that I reached out to those and said, who's willing to share an hour on a Wednesday, right?
That's great. People are desperate to have someone ask their opinion on stuff. So that's great.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to circle us back to where we started the meeting, because we have 4 minutes left and we need to give the Zoom to the Student Advisory Committee. So I want to wrap up in this way. At the start of the meeting, and before Dr. Reed was able to be here and Mr. Parker was not able to hear us, it sounded like we talked a little bit about the fact that right now, Representative Thompson, Vice President Thompson, and I are working through connecting with every member of the board to understand what committees they served on last year, what committees they want to continue to serve on, if there are leadership roles they'd like to take on. So we're going to hopefully bring an outline of some things we're thinking about to the working session next week. And I've talked with some folks about chairing this committee. So that'll be part of what we're able to talk about a little bit more next week. It sounds like people feel like key areas of work for this committee need to continue to be reading and literacy work. And given what Representative Chang just outlined, like that is a meaty body of work that really could inform a lot of the work of this committee. The social studies work, which is ongoing. We don't have any more detailed timeline from OSSE yet, though I hope that I will by the working session have that more detailed timeline. Would be a second piece of the work. And then this question around codifying standards, whether we do it in state board policy or we do it some other way in statute in the city, would seem to be the final thing. And that would really be an enormous body of work for the year, with anything else that came up being able to maybe be pulled in for discussion. So if a particular set of standards came up, or OSSE took steps to move ahead on digital learning in a more codified way, that could sit here. The other discussion we had at the start, Dr. Reed, this is particularly important for you, I think, is whether the third Wednesday from 4:30 to 6 was still a good time for the standard meeting for this committee, because I know that our staff is trying to get those things calendared for the year.
Yes, it should be fine.
Cool. So with that, at the working session, I promise in my capacity as president to bring some more information about what we're thinking about for leadership of this committee and going forward. I've still got conversations to have. I have to follow up with Representative Chang again and follow up with President Parker, or with former President Parker. I need to touch base with Representative Wattenberg tomorrow morning, and still scheduling a time with Representative Reed to connect. So I promise to bring to the working session some more information on leadership of this committee, as well as an update from OSSE on social studies. Representative Chang, I'll also check in with you to find out what is helpful for next steps on literacy to share with the full board, so that if there are ways that we can harness them in, we can do that.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for your feedback too, and for entertaining another conversation about literacy for 30 minutes. And yeah, look forward to our next one.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all for giving us an hour tonight. See you soon.